Tonight, let us step quietly across the threshold of time. Imagine the world thousands of years ago when the night sky was brighter than fire and the boundaries between the living and the divine felt thin as a veil. In the flicker of torches, entire communities gathered, their faces solemn, their eyes lifted, not toward one another, but toward the heavens. At the center of these gatherings was always the same question, whispered in countless tongues. How can fragile human beings bargain with forces greater than themselves? For the ancients, the answer was written not in ink, but in blood. Across deserts and jungles, along rivers and mountains, cultures that never met one another reached for the same ritual. The Sumerians of Mesopotamia, the pharaohs of Egypt, the priests of the Maya, the builders of Angkor, the Druids of Celtic Europe, each believed that the lifeblood of man was more than liquid. It was a key, a currency, a bridge to the gods. Some offered animals, some offered crops, but when the harvest failed, or the sky darkened, when famine or plague struck, the offerings grew darker. People were chosen, prisoners, servants, sometimes even children of noble blood, to stand before the altar. Their deaths, the ancients believed, were not endings but gifts exchanged for rain, for victory, for eternal life. It is unsettling, perhaps, to imagine such scenes, but beneath the horror lies something profoundly human, fear of the unknown and the longing to control destiny. Blood was the language through which entire civilizations tried to speak to the cosmos. Tonight, we will follow that language across centuries and continents, from the first clay tablets of Sumer to the towering pyramids of Egypt, to the stone temples of the Maya and the Aztec Empire, where hearts were lifted to the sun. We will travel to the misty mountains of the Andes, the lost cities of the Khmer, and the shadowy groves of the Celtic Druids. Each place tells the same story in a different voice. Humanity's desperate hope that sacrifice could bend the will of the gods. Yet we must ask, was it truly faith that demanded blood, or was it power, woven carefully by kings and priests, that taught people to believe so? That mystery will guide us through the journey tonight. From the earliest traces of human ritual, one element appears again and again: blood. To ancient peoples, blood was not simply a physical substance. It was life itself, the essence that carried breath, strength, and even the soul. Cave paintings in southern France show animals pierced and bleeding, their lifeblood flowing toward hunters who believed the spirit of the beast would grant them power. Thousands of years later, the Sumerians inscribed on clay tablets that blood was a gift, pleasing to the gods, a bridge between earth and sky. The idea spread without contact. In the Nile Valley, Egyptians wrote in the pyramid texts that the gods fed on red essence. In Mesoamerica, centuries before the Aztec, the Maya pierced their own skin, letting blood drip on paper, then burning it so that the smoke might carry their prayers upward. Even far to the north, among early Celtic tribes, warriors believed that spilling blood in battle could appease unseen forces of nature. Why blood? Modern scholars suggest several reasons. It is immediate, vivid, and impossible to ignore. It was proof of vitality. Once it flowed, life itself slipped away. To give blood, whether one's own or another's, was the ultimate gesture of surrender to forces greater than human control. And in an age when famine, storms, or sudden death could not be explained, the willingness to offer that most precious essence seemed the only possible way to restore balance. Thus, by the dawn of the first civilizations, blood sacrifice was not an anomaly, but a shared human language. It was whispered in different tongues, carved into stone, painted on temple walls, but always carrying the same message. Here is life, offered so that life may continue. Across the ancient world, rituals of offering were never random acts of desperation. They were carefully orchestrated ceremonies woven into the very structure of society. At their center stood two figures of immense influence, the priest and the ruler. The ruler claimed authority from the gods, but it was the priest who interpreted divine will, who told the people what the heavens demanded. Together they formed a partnership of power, one ruling bodies, the other ruling souls. In Egypt, the pharaoh was seen as the living embodiment of Horus, yet even he required priests to maintain harmony with the unseen realm. In Mesopotamia, kings built ziggurats not only as monuments of stone, but as stairways where offerings could ascend to the divine. And in the Maya lowlands, city-states rose around temple complexes where religious specialists prepared elaborate calendars to decide when rituals must occur. What made these acts so compelling was fear. Nature in those ages was unpredictable. Rivers flooded, crops failed, and disease swept through entire villages without warning. To ordinary people, these were not random events, but messages. If a harvest rotted in the field, it meant the gods had turned their gaze away. If illness spread, it was believed some unseen balance had been broken. The role of priests was to decode these mysteries and prescribe the remedy, often through symbolic offerings. Yet the practice was never purely spiritual. Rulers and priests understood that ritual bound communities together. When an entire city gathered at the temple steps when they witnessed the ceremony under the rising sun, they were not only speaking to the gods, they were reaffirming who held authority among men. The spectacle itself was a form of governance, reminding people that survival depended on obedience, and that obedience was sanctified. Thus, by the first millennium BCE, blood rituals had become not only acts of faith, but instruments of order. They were performed to appease the heavens, but also to reinforce the earthly hierarchy. And so a single question lingers. When we look back at these ceremonies, are we seeing expressions of genuine belief or carefully crafted performances designed to preserve power? Every ritual had its stage, and upon that stage, three kinds of figures always appeared. At the highest point stood the ruler. Whether titled pharaoh, king, emperor, or simply chief, he embodied the connection between earth and heaven. To the people, his body was not just flesh and bone, it was a vessel of divine authority. When the Nile flooded or when the sun rose without fail, it was credited to his harmony with the gods. If disaster struck, it was he who must prove devotion strong enough to restore balance. Beside him stood the priestly order. These were the interpreters of mystery, guardians of calendars and omens. In Mesopotamia, they tracked the stars and declared which nights were auspicious. In Mesoamerica, they painted codices with symbols that mapped cycles of time. In Angkor, inscriptions describe holy men who blessed the foundations of temples. Priests acted as translators between two realms, telling the people what the gods demanded and assuring the gods that the people had obeyed. Without them, the divine voice would have remained silent. And then there were those chosen to participate most directly in the offering. They might be prisoners of war, servants from royal households, or in some cases members of noble families whose participation was seen as the highest honor. To modern ears, this seems unimaginable, but in many ancient contexts, to be chosen was not always regarded as punishment. In the Andes, children prepared for the mountaintop ceremonies were treated with reverence, fed special diets, and clothed in fine garments. In Egypt, those buried beside the king were placed in tombs designed to echo the afterlife journey of their master. For the community, their roles symbolized loyalty carried beyond the limits of mortality. Together, these three groups formed the triangle of sacred drama: ruler, priest, and chosen participant. Each played a part that reinforced the other. The ruler displayed power, the priest defined meaning, and the chosen embodied sacrifice. Without one, the ritual would collapse. With all three, the ceremony became a living narrative, retold across generations as proof that order still held in a world of chaos. And so we must ask, were these figures free actors, or were they themselves bound by a script written long before their birth? A script that declared some must rule, some must interpret, and some must give everything so that the cycle could continue. Let us begin where written history itself first took shape. In the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, here, around 3000 BCE, the earliest cities rose: Uruk, Ur, Lagash, cities of mud-brick walls and towering temples that pierced the sky like stairways to the divine. Within these temple precincts, people carved the first known records of human belief into soft clay. And among those wedge-shaped lines, we find something striking: the language of offering. The Sumerians believed their gods were not distant abstractions, but living forces, as real as the rivers that flooded each spring. Anu ruled the heavens, Enlil commanded the air, Enki the waters, and Inanna embodied love and war. These gods, powerful yet unpredictable, were thought to depend on human devotion to maintain balance. To neglect them was to invite disaster. The clay tablets of Uruk speak of rituals where grain, beer, and animals were presented in abundance. But woven among these accounts are darker lines, references to offerings of the blood of man, given in times of famine or plague. Archaeologists excavating the royal cemetery of Ur uncovered burial pits where servants lay beside their rulers, their presence suggesting loyalty carried into eternity. And at the site of Mari, human remains found near temple altars raise questions. Were these accidental burials or the remnants of a ceremony meant to appease angry gods? One ancient hymn to Inanna describes her as a goddess who drinks the essence of warriors and grants victory. Some scholars interpret this metaphorically, yet others point to its literal implications, that the life force itself, the red vitality of blood, was considered the most precious gift of all. To spill it in ritual was not viewed as cruelty, but as necessity, an exchange to keep rivers flowing, crops growing, and enemies at bay. The ordinary citizens of Mesopotamia watched these ceremonies with awe. They believed that without such offerings, the fragile order of their world could collapse. The king, guided by priests, thus stood as guarantor of cosmic harmony. His authority was proven not only on the battlefield, but at the altar, where devotion was measured in the willingness to give what was most valuable. And so at the dawn of civilization, we see the first clear evidence that humanity had already linked survival with sacrifice. Yet what began as symbolic gestures of food and drink would, in moments of crisis, turn into rituals marked by lifeblood. It was here, in the shadow of the first ziggurats, that the pattern was set, a pattern echoing across empires for millennia. As Mesopotamian cities grew wealthier, they also became more vulnerable. Crops depended on the seasonal floods, but when the waters failed, famine followed. Diseases moved swiftly through crowded streets. Enemies pressed at the city walls, and in moments of collective fear, the priests declared that ordinary offerings were no longer enough. The gods demanded something greater. Clay tablets from the city of Lagash record a devastating drought around 2200 BCE. In the inscriptions, officials describe the land cracked open, the fields gave no grain. The king of the time, desperate to save his people, turned to the temple of Ningirsu, a warrior deity. There, according to later chronicles, ceremonies were held in which captives from neighboring tribes were presented as gifts. Their lives, it was believed, would renew the covenant with the gods and call back the rain. Archaeology provides silent confirmation. At the site of Mari, layers of ash mixed with human remains were discovered near the foundations of a temple. Some scholars suggest this was evidence of sacrificial fires during an epidemic. Others caution that we cannot be certain, but the alignment of the remains with ritual altars raises troubling questions. Similarly, at Ur, the famous royal cemetery revealed not only golden treasures but also rows of attendants buried alongside their rulers. Some wore elaborate jewelry, suggesting their deaths were staged as part of a grand ceremonial departure. Mesopotamian hymns themselves hint at these practices. One dedicated to the goddess Ninhursag speaks of the blood that renews the soil, linking human vitality directly to agricultural cycles. Another to Inanna declares she feeds upon the lifeblood of the chosen and grants victory in return. Whether metaphor or reality, these lines reflect a worldview in which sacrifice was not cruelty but necessity, and yet behind the chants and solemn processions, there was also politics. To declare that the gods required extraordinary gifts was to reinforce the authority of priests and kings. The rituals united people through fear and hope, binding them together in obedience. Even if the rains did not come immediately, the community believed it had done its part, and that reassurance itself gave strength. These central events in Mesopotamian history show us that sacrifice was never random. It was carefully staged, deeply symbolic, and anchored in the crises of life along the rivers. In the smoke rising from altars, people thought they saw not loss, but survival. The rituals of Mesopotamia left behind more than fading chants and broken tablets. They carved themselves into the very foundations of cities. Archaeologists working at Ur and Kish have uncovered temple platforms with unusual stains in the soil, traces that suggest liquid offerings seeped into the earth as part of consecration rites. Some scholars believe these were remnants of animal sacrifices, while others cautiously raise the possibility of human involvement. Whatever the source, the idea was clear. The ground itself had to be fed in order to hold the weight of civilization. As kingdoms rose and fell, the practice evolved. The Akkadians, who conquered Sumer around 2300 BCE, absorbed the rituals into their own state religion. In royal inscriptions, King Naram-Sin claimed the gods favored his rule because he gave them the essence of enemies. Whether literal or metaphorical, these words echo the same belief that divine approval could be purchased and the currency was life itself. Yet the consequences were not only spiritual. Rituals of blood also became tools of memory. A city could claim that its survival during famine or plague was proof that its offerings had been accepted. Future generations looking back would see not random chance but divine response. In this way, history itself was shaped by ritual, each sacrifice transforming disaster into narrative. But mysteries remain. Why do some tablets speak of vast ceremonies while others are silent? Why do we find human remains near altars in some sites but not in others? Was sacrifice common or exceptional, reserved only for the darkest crises? Modern scholars debate these questions endlessly. Some argue that references to blood of man were symbolic, metaphors for loyalty or service. Others contend that the consistency of evidence, from burials in to hymns for Inanna, cannot be dismissed as coincidence. What is certain is that Mesopotamia set a precedent. In the shadow of its ziggurats, humanity first tied survival to sacred offering. The logic of these acts, that life must be given to preserve life, would echo across continents, resurfacing in temples from Egypt to the Andes. And so, as the great rivers carried silt to the plains, they also carried an idea that would not wash away, that the destiny of a people could be written in lifeblood. Along the banks of the Nile, where the river rose and fell with the rhythm of the seasons, the Egyptians built a civilization devoted to eternity. Every temple, every tomb, every line of hieroglyphics was a message to the future, declaring that life did not end with death, it simply transformed. At the heart of this belief stood the pharaoh, not merely a ruler but the living embodiment of Horus, destined to become Osiris after death. To preserve his journey into the afterlife was to preserve the order of the cosmos itself. The pyramid texts carved deep within the burial chambers of the Old Kingdom speak of offerings described as the red essence of life. Scholars debate whether these passages refer to symbolic libations of wine or something more literal. But what is certain is that vitality, the spark of being, was considered nourishment for the gods. To withhold it was to risk cosmic imbalance. Archaeological evidence adds weight to the texts. At the royal tomb of Pharaoh Jer, dated to around 2900 BCE in Abydos, excavators uncovered hundreds of subsidiary graves clustered around the king's burial chamber. Many of the individuals interred there appeared to have died at the same time, suggesting they were not accidental burials, but deliberate companions for their ruler's journey. Some were adorned with ornaments, as though honored for their role in escorting the pharaoh beyond the veil. For the Egyptians, this was not viewed as cruelty, but as continuity. The king could not walk into the afterlife alone. His attendants, his guards, even his animals must accompany him, maintaining the same order in death that had existed in life. In this way, blood and loyalty merged into a single offering, ensuring that Pharaoh's power endured beyond the horizon. This belief in immortality extended far beyond royal tombs. Ordinary Egyptians, though never part of such elaborate rituals, echoed the same conviction when they left food, drink, tokens of vitality in the graves of their loved ones. To them, every offering was a miniature reflection of the pharaoh's great passage, a way to keep the cycle unbroken. Thus, in Egypt, blood sacrifice was not only about pleasing the gods, it was about preserving eternity itself. To deny the pharaoh his offerings would be to deny the rising of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, and the order of the universe. If we travel in imagination to the desert plateau of Abydos around 2900 BCE, we find one of the most remarkable burial sites of early Egypt, the tomb of Pharaoh Jer. Here, beneath the sand, archaeologists uncovered not just the chamber of the king, but a constellation of smaller graves surrounding it, more than 300 in all. Their alignment and uniformity suggest they were not scattered accidents, but part of a single grand ceremony. Scholars believe these burials represent attendants, soldiers, and even musicians who followed their king into death. Some were interred with jewelry or personal possessions, as though honored participants in a sacred rite. To the ancient Egyptians, this was not an act of loss but of loyalty, ensuring that the pharaoh's court, his protectors and servants, would continue to serve him in the eternal realm. Later dynasties continued to echo this tradition in different forms. In the first dynasty, subsidiary burials are common near royal tombs, though the practice gradually diminished in favor of symbolic substitutes like carved figurines known as ushabti. These small statues, placed in the tombs of pharaohs and nobles, were meant to act as spiritual stand-ins, performing tasks in the afterlife so that living attendants no longer had to accompany their masters in person. The ceremonies at Abydos, however, remain a unique window into the earliest expressions of Egyptian belief. They reveal a conviction that eternity was not solitary but communal. The pharaoh's survival beyond death depended on a retinue of companions, a reflection of the cosmic order he was sworn to uphold. Without them, the balance of the world might falter. Written records from the Middle Kingdom emphasize this idea of balance. Hymns to Osiris speak of blood and breath as offerings that quicken the god and steady the heavens. Whether these words were metaphorical or literal, the message was the same. Vitality must be given so that life, both human and divine, could continue. The great ceremonies at Abydos remind us that sacrifice in Egypt was never an isolated event. It was theatre, devotion, and politics bound together, watched by thousands who believed their own survival was tied to the pharaoh's eternal journey. And as the desert winds covered these tombs with sand, the stories of those ceremonies endured in stone and memory, whispering of a time when death itself was carefully staged to guarantee everlasting life. Over time, Egypt's relationship with sacrifice began to change. The earliest dynasties left behind striking evidence of attendants buried beside their rulers, but as centuries passed, such practices diminished. By the Middle Kingdom, the Egyptian vision of devotion had evolved into something more symbolic, though no less profound. Instead of demanding real lives at the tomb, the Egyptians created small figurines carved from wood, stone, or faience. These figures, known as ushabti, were inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead. Their purpose was clear. In the afterlife, they would awaken at the pharaoh's command, ready to perform any task he required. To the living, these figures were both practical and merciful. They preserved the ritual function of attendants without the need for living companions to be buried. This transition reveals much about Egyptian society. It suggests an increasing concern with the sanctity of life, or perhaps with the efficiency of ritual. A figurine could serve for eternity without fear of rebellion, exhaustion, or sorrow. It also indicates a shift in theology. The gods no longer required literal lifeblood, so long as symbols and words carried the essence of devotion. And yet traces of older practices lingered in memory. Inscriptions from Thebes describe temple rites in which red wine was poured onto the ground, described as the essence of men. The substitution is telling, a symbolic fluid taking the place of something once real, a reminder of the power that blood had once held in ritual imagination. Some Egyptologists believe this evolution was also political. By reducing the scale of direct sacrifice, pharaohs maintained the grandeur of tradition while softening its impact on the population. A workforce spared from burial was a workforce that could continue building temples, harvesting crops, and serving the state. Symbolism thus protected both human lives and imperial stability. But the question lingers, did this change reflect compassion or simply convenience? Was it a moral awakening or a calculated adaptation? We may never know. What we do know is that Egypt left us one of the earliest examples of transformation in sacrificial practice, from literal companions in the sand to carved substitutes that could serve forever. This shift also marked a broader truth. Even in civilizations devoted to eternity, rituals were never static. They adapted, reshaped, and reinterpreted themselves to fit the needs of both gods and men. And as the Ushabti stood silently in the tombs of kings, they whispered of a world still bound to the belief that life must be given, if not in flesh, then in form. Far across the ocean from Egypt's deserts, deep within the jungles of Central America, the Maya built soaring pyramids of stone that rose above the canopy. Their cities, Tikal, Palenque, Bonampak, were alive with color, adorned with painted murals and carved stelae that recorded not only battles and dynasties, but also rituals meant to connect Earth with the heavens. Among the most striking of these was the practice of self-bloodletting, a ceremony through which rulers and nobles sought to nourish the gods with their own essence. In Maya belief, the cosmos was fragile, maintained only through constant dialogue between humans and the divine. Blood was the channel of that dialogue, the visible proof that devotion was sincere. Unlike in Mesopotamia or Egypt, where captives or attendants often carried the burden, here the highest members of society, kings, queens, and priests, took the act upon themselves. They pierced their skin with obsidian blades or stingray spines, drawing thin streams onto strips of bark paper. These offerings were then burned, the rising smoke believed to carry prayers directly into the other world. The murals of Bonampak, painted in the 8th century, vividly depict nobles engaged in this ritual. One panel shows Lady Zok, Queen of Yachilan, pulling a thorned rope through her tongue. To the modern eye, the image is unsettling, but to the Maya it was a display of supreme devotion. The blood shed in such moments was not seen as loss, but as the key to opening portals through which ancestors and gods might appear. Texts like the Popol Vuh, the Maya Book of Creation, reinforce this worldview. They describe gods forming the first humans from maize dough mixed with divine blood. Life itself, in Maya thought, was literally infused with sacred essence. To offer one's own was therefore to return what had been given. The significance extended beyond religion. By performing these acts publicly, rulers proved their right to govern. They demonstrated courage, piety, and the ability to sustain the cosmic order. The people watching from temple plazas believed that their city's survival depended on the willingness of their leaders to give part of themselves. Thus, in the Maya world, bloodletting was not merely a ritual, it was politics, theology, and theatre combined. It assured the people that the gods were satisfied and that the fragile balance of the cosmos would continue another day. If the Maya believed that the lifeblood of kings kept the cosmos in motion, the Aztec took that principle to a scale unmatched in human history. In the heart of their capital city, Tenochtitlan, stood the Templo Maya, a twin pyramid temple rising above a lake of shimmering water. Dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war, and Tlaloc, god of rain, it was here that the Aztecs staged ceremonies meant to sustain the universe itself. Aztec cosmology taught that the sun required nourishment to rise each morning. Without offerings, darkness would triumph and the world would end. Unlike the Maya, who emphasized self-offering among nobles, the Aztec turned to captured warriors as the most valued gifts. To them, the vitality of a brave enemy was the purest form of fuel for the gods. Spanish chroniclers such as Bernardino de Sahagún recorded that during the dedication of the Templo Mayor in 1487, thousands of captives were presented over several days of ritual. While the exact numbers are debated, archaeology confirms the scale. Beneath the temple precinct, archaeologists have uncovered skull racks known as tzompantli, structures built to display the remains of those offered. Recent excavations in Mexico City revealed hundreds of skulls cemented into circular towers, silent witnesses to ceremonies once watched by tens of thousands. To the Aztec, these rituals were not hidden acts of cruelty but public affirmations of cosmic duty. Each heart lifted toward the sky, each chant echoing across the plaza, was proof that their empire upheld the sun's daily rebirth. For the people watching, it was both terrifying and reassuring. Terrifying because the stakes were so high, reassuring because survival was visibly being secured through ritual. But beyond theology lay politics. By conducting such massive ceremonies, emperors like Ahuitzotl and Moctezuma projected their power. They reminded both allies and enemies that Tenochtitlan was not just a city, but the axis of the universe, a place where gods were literally fed. The grandeur of the ritual bound the empire together, uniting conquered peoples in both fear and awe. Thus the offerings at Templo Mayor were more than religious devotion. They were instruments of statecraft, cosmic theater, and collective identity. The Aztec believed the universe itself depended on their devotion, and in turn, their devotion sustained the empire's authority. When Hernán Cortés and his companions first entered Tenochtitlan in 1519, they marveled at its scale. Canals glistening in the sun, markets filled with thousands of traders, and the great Templo Mayor towering above it all. But soon their awe turned to shock. For within the temple precinct, they witnessed ceremonies unlike any in Europe. Spanish accounts describe altars stained with offerings, skull racks rising like palisades, and priests dressed in darkened garments of ritual. To the conquistadors, these were signs of barbarity. To the Aztec, they were assurances that the cosmos was still intact. The cultural collision could not have been sharper. In Christian theology, sacrifice had been reinterpreted as symbolic, the bread and wine of communion representing blood and body. In Aztec cosmology, the act remained literal and essential. The conquistadors saw only cruelty. The Aztec saw devotion necessary for survival. Each side judged the other by its own framework, and neither could comprehend the other's logic. The consequences were swift. Cortés and his allies used these rituals as justification for conquest, presenting themselves as liberators extinguishing an empire of terror. Yet modern historians caution against taking Spanish accounts at face value. While evidence of large-scale offerings is undeniable, numbers were often exaggerated to magnify the conqueror's triumph. Archaeological studies suggest thousands may have been offered across years, but not the fantastical hundreds of thousands claimed in early reports. Still, the encounter changed everything. It changed With the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, the great ceremonies of the Templo Mayor ended. The Spaniards dismantled parts of the temple, building a cathedral atop its ruins as a symbol of a new order. The rituals that had once bound the empire together were condemned and suppressed. Yet beneath the stones traces remained, skull racks hidden under earth, murals buried by time, and codices secretly preserved by indigenous scribes. For the Aztec, the loss was not only political, but cosmic. To them, the end of their empire risked the end of the sun itself. To the Spaniards, it was proof that their god had triumphed. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. A meeting of two worldviews, one fading into silence, the other rising with conquest. The legacy of these encounters lingers. Even today, when archaeologists uncover remains beneath Mexico City, we are reminded that behind the clash of empires was a deeper question. How much are humans willing to give to keep the universe alive? Long before the pyramids of Egypt or the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, high on a limestone ridge in what is now southeastern Turkey, people gathered to build something extraordinary. Around 9600 BCE, hunter-gatherers raised massive stone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, in circular enclosures that would later be buried under earth for thousands of years. When archaeologists uncovered them in the 1990s, they realized they had found something older than any known temple, Göbekli Tepe, often called the world's first sanctuary. The pillars are carved with animals both fierce and mysterious, lions, snakes, scorpions, vultures, and boars. Some scholars believe these images represented protective spirits or cosmic powers, others that they symbolized the dangers of life on the edge of survival. In between the carvings, benches, and stone basins suggest rituals of gathering, feasting, and offering. What exactly was offered remains uncertain, but traces of bones, both animal and human, have been found within the enclosures, leading to speculation that blood played a role in ceremonies. The timing of Göbekli Tepe is as striking as its scale. It predates agriculture and permanent villages. These were not farmers building temples to support an established state. They were nomadic groups coming together for reasons that appear to be spiritual before they were practical. Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who led excavations, argued that religion may have come before farming, that the urge to worship drew people together, and only afterward did they settle down to cultivate the land. In this context, offerings of blood, whether animal or human, would have carried enormous symbolic weight. To give life back to the earth was to acknowledge dependence on forces beyond human control. The massive labor of quarrying and erecting the pillars itself could be seen as a form of sacrifice, a devotion written in stone rather than flesh. Yet the hints of remains within the site remind us that ritual and mortality were never far apart. Göbekli Tepe challenges our assumptions about civilization. It suggests that the oldest impulse of humanity was not to plant seeds or to wage war, but to gather and to give, to seek meaning through ritual, to mark the earth with symbols of power, and perhaps to let blood flow so that life itself might continue. Standing among the monumental pillars of Göbekli Tepe, one cannot help but wonder what ceremonies once unfolded there. Though no written records survive, the site is thousands of years older than the invention of writing. Archaeology has offered intriguing clues. Excavations revealed stone basins large enough to hold liquids, carved troughs, and platforms that may have served as altars. Nearby, researchers discovered vast amounts of animal bones, many deliberately broken, suggesting ritual feasting on a communal scale. But among the remains were also fragments that hint at something deeper. Human bones bearing marks that some interpret as cut lines were found within the enclosures. Scholars are cautious, noting that alternative explanations exist, secondary burial practices or symbolic treatment of ancestors. Yet the presence of these remains, combined with the imagery carved into the stones, has led many to propose that ceremonies at Göbekli Tepe may have involved offerings of blood, both animal and possibly human. The symbolism carved into the site supports this interpretation. Vultures, for instance, are depicted in prominent relief. In many ancient cultures, vultures were linked with death rituals, as they were known to consume the flesh of the deceased and thus carry the spirit skyward. The combination of vulture imagery, basins for liquids, and human bone fragments suggests that rituals of transition between life and death, earth and heaven, were central here. Even the architecture seems designed for drama. The circular enclosures create enclosed spaces where participants could gather around the towering central pillars. When torches flickered against the carved animals, shadows would have danced across the stones, creating an atmosphere both terrifying and sacred. In such a setting, the spilling of blood, real or symbolic, would have carried a power far greater than words. Archaeologist Klaus Schmidt argued that Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement but a pilgrimage center. Nomadic groups from across the region may have come here seasonally, bringing animals to sacrifice, feasting together, and perhaps witnessing rites that demanded offerings of life itself. The effort required to build the site, moving tons of stone without wheels or metal tools, already speaks of extraordinary devotion. It was, in every sense, a temple of giving. Whether or not human sacrifice occurred here remains debated, but the evidence suggests at least the possibility. And in that uncertainty lies a haunting truth. The world's oldest sanctuary may have been consecrated with blood, binding its stones to the eternal cycle of life and death. When Göbekli Tepe was first unearthed, it rewrote our understanding of history. For decades, scholars had believed that religion followed agriculture, that people settled, farmed, and only then built temples. But this sanctuary, older than farming itself, suggested the opposite. It was the urge to worship, to offer, and perhaps to sacrifice that brought communities together in the first place. The legacy of Göbekli Tepe stretches far beyond its hilltop stones. Later, Neolithic sites, such as Çatalhöyük, show burials within houses where human remains were placed beneath the floors of family dwellings. Some skulls were even plastered and displayed, suggesting ritual significance that may trace back to earlier traditions of offering life to sanctify space. Across Europe, monuments like Stonehenge echo similar patterns, massive stones arranged in circles, aligned with celestial events, hinting at ceremonies that linked blood, time, and the cosmos. The animal imagery of Göbekli Tepe also resonates with later cultures. Lions, serpents, and vultures reappear in mythologies from Mesopotamia to Egypt, carrying associations with death, fertility, and cosmic struggle. Whether by direct transmission or parallel imagination, the idea that life and death were bound in sacred cycles persisted across millennia. Yet for all its influence, Göbekli Tepe remains cloaked in questions. Why were its enclosures deliberately buried, as if hidden from future eyes? Was it an act of reverence, preserving the sanctity of a completed ritual cycle? Or was it fear that the powers invoked there had grown too strong, demanding to be sealed away. Some scholars argue the site was a place of pilgrimage, where seasonal gatherings included feasts, rituals, and offerings that bound scattered tribes into shared identity. Others suggest it was a temple of death, where blood, whether animal or human, was the ultimate medium between earth and the divine. Still others believe it symbolized rebirth, its circular design representing the endless return of life through sacrifice. What we know for certain is this: Göbekli Tepe stands as humanity's first monumental expression of devotion, older than writing, older than farming, older even than cities. Its stones whisper of a time when the deepest instinct was not to control the earth, but to honor the unseen forces that governed it. And if blood was indeed spilled there, it means that from the very dawn of religion, humanity believed life itself was the price of cosmic order. Long before Rome became the empire we remember, the Italian peninsula was home to the Etruscans, a mysterious people whose language remains only partly understood. Flourishing between the 8th and 5th centuries BCE, the Etruscans were skilled builders, metalworkers, and artists. Their tombs, carved deep into hillsides and painted with vibrant frescoes, reveal a society that valued ritual and the journey into the afterlife. And at the heart of those rituals lay practices that linked death with devotion. Greek and Roman writers described the Etruscans as masters of divination, able to read the will of the gods in the flight of birds or the entrails of animals. Yet some accounts hint at darker rites. The historian Livy and later commentators suggested that in times of crisis, the Etruscans might consecrate prisoners or slaves to the gods of the underworld. Archaeology adds weight to these claims. Excavations of certain Etruscan necropolises have revealed secondary burials where attendants or servants appear to have been interred alongside their masters. One site in particular, the Banditaccia necropolis at Cerveteri, shows tombs laid out like entire cities for the dead, complete with houses carved in stone. Within some, evidence suggests that more than one body was placed at the time of burial, not all of them of high status. Scholars debate whether these were symbolic companions, family members, or individuals chosen to serve their lords beyond death. Whatever the case, the practice reflects a belief that the afterlife required not only possessions, but people, that loyalty extended past the threshold of mortality. The symbolism of blood and devotion is woven into Etruscan religion. Deities like Orcus, ruler of the underworld, or the twin figures Castor and Poultice, demanded rights to secure balance between the worlds. By accompanying their masters into the tomb, attendants became part of that sacred exchange. To the Etruscans, this was not abandonment but assurance that their dead entered the next realm surrounded by familiar faces, guarded and served as in life. In time, Rome would inherit and transform these practices. What began as solemn rituals within tombs would evolve into public spectacles, carried out not in darkness, but beneath the gaze of thousands. The Etruscan legacy lived on, reshaped by the rising power of the Republic and then the Empire. When Rome emerged as the dominant power of the Italian peninsula, it absorbed many traditions from its Etruscan neighbors. Among them was the belief that blood could consecrate the passage of the dead. In early Roman funerary rites, families staged combats at gravesides, pitting captives or slaves against one another. These contests were known as munera, literally duties or obligations, offerings to honor the departed. For the Romans, such spectacles provided both tribute to the deceased and appeasement to the gods below. The earliest recorded munus occurred in 264 BCE, when the sons of a nobleman named Junius Brutus honored their father's death by arranging combat between three pairs of fighters in the Forum Boarium. Though modest in scale, it set a precedent. Over time, these funerary contests grew larger, more elaborate, and increasingly detached from their original purpose. What began as solemn rites at tombs gradually shifted into public entertainment. By the late Republic, gladiatorial games had become a hallmark of Roman life. Amphitheatres replaced gravesides as the stage. The Colosseum, completed in 80 CE under Emperor Titus, was the grand culmination of this tradition, an arena capable of seating 50,000 spectators, its floor drenched not only with sweat, but with the symbolism of sacrifice. For the crowd, each clash was both diversion and ritual. The roar of approval, the gestures of mercy or death, all echoed the ancient conviction that human vitality carried divine meaning. Roman authors themselves acknowledged the sacred undertones. Cicero, while critical of the cruelty, admitted that such spectacles reminded citizens of courage and mortality. Seneca wrote that watching the contests stirred reflections on fate and the brevity of life. Beneath the pageantry, the logic of sacrifice still lingered. Blood offered in the arena, though no longer tied to funerals, was thought to cleanse, inspire, and bind the community together. For emperors, the games became instruments of power. By sponsoring spectacles of unprecedented scale, hundreds of combats in a single festival, they demonstrated both wealth and piety. Bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal later called them, ensured loyalty from the masses. And while the Etruscan rites had once been intimate ceremonies of grief, Rome turned them outward, transforming private devotion into public theatre. In this way, the munera evolved from duty to entertainment, from tomb to amphitheatre. Yet the core idea remained: life could be taken or displayed in the name of honoring forces beyond the individual. What began in shadows beneath the earth now thundered beneath the open sky, watched by thousands whose faith in Rome itself was renewed with every spectacle. As centuries passed, Rome's appetite for blood spectacles began to wane. By the late Empire, the endless cycle of gladiatorial games grew costly, draining both the treasury and the supply of fighters. More importantly, the rise of Christianity brought a profound change in how sacrifice was understood. No longer was the shedding of real blood seen as necessary to honor gods or community. Instead, blood became a metaphor, a symbol that carried spiritual rather than physical weight. Early Christian writers condemned the games as cruel distractions. Tertullian, in the 2nd century, described the amphitheatre as a place of death disguised as pleasure. By the 4th century, Emperor Constantine, having embraced Christianity, restricted gladiatorial contests, and later emperors moved to ban them altogether. Yet the need for ritual never disappeared, it simply transformed. In Christian theology, the crucifixion of Jesus was interpreted as the ultimate and final sacrifice. His blood, shed once, was believed to redeem humanity for all time. In this light, further offerings of human lives were unnecessary, even blasphemous. What remained was remembrance, enacted through symbols. Thus, in the rite of the Eucharist, bread and wine came to represent body and blood, tokens that evoked the essence of sacrifice without repeating its violence. Archaeological evidence reflects this shift. In places where arenas once echoed with the clash of steel, churches were constructed, The Colosseum itself was eventually consecrated as a Christian site, its stones reinterpreted as a monument not to death, but to faith. The very language of sacrifice endured, but its meaning had changed. No longer about appeasing gods with lifeblood, it became about communion, memory, and inner devotion. This transition from real to symbolic sacrifice marks one of the most significant turning points in human history. It shows that rituals, however deeply ingrained, are not immutable. They evolve with culture, belief, and circumstance. What the Etruscans began in tombs, what Rome magnified in arenas, was eventually transfigured into a sacrament meant to unite rather than divide, to inspire reverence rather than fear. And so, as the lights of Rome's amphitheatres dimmed, a new tradition took root, one that replaced blood with wine, flesh with bread, and spectacle with prayer. The ancient belief remained that life must be given for life to continue, but now it was retold in the language of symbol, a reminder that even the darkest rituals can be reborn in gentler forms. In the jungles of Cambodia, the Khmer Empire rose as one of the greatest civilizations of Southeast Asia. From the 9th to the 15th century, it constructed vast reservoirs, causeways, and temples, the most famous of which is Angkor Wat. These structures, built with astonishing precision and scale, were not only architectural marvels, but also spiritual landscapes, designed to mirror the cosmos itself. Yet beneath their grandeur lies whispers of darker traditions carved into stone and preserved in legend. Inscriptions found on Khmer stelae refer to rituals of consecration, ceremonies meant to sanctify new temples or bridges. Among these, scholars have noted phrases describing the giving of life to the foundation. While the language is poetic, local traditions passed down through centuries speak more directly. That human beings, often children, were buried beneath the cornerstones of great monuments, their vitality binding the structure to the earth. Archaeological surveys at Angkor and surrounding sites add some weight to these legends. At certain temple foundations, remains of young individuals have been discovered, positioned in ways that suggest deliberate placement rather than ordinary burials. Though the evidence is fragmentary and interpretations differ, the alignment with inscriptions and folklore is difficult to dismiss. The belief, it seems, was that the spirit of the sacrificed would guard the building, ensuring its strength against time and disaster. Such myths are not unique to Cambodia. Across Asia, from India to China, stories abound of foundation sacrifices, of lives offered so that bridges would not collapse, so that towers would stand firm. In the Khmer world, however, these practices were integrated into a grand cosmological vision. Temples were seen as earthly reflections of Mount Meru, the axis of the universe. To sanctify them with the essence of life was to root the cosmos itself in stability. For the ordinary people who witnessed these ceremonies, the message was clear. The king had bound heaven and earth together through ritual. The monuments of Angkor were not only political statements of power, but spiritual guarantees of cosmic harmony. To question the necessity of the offering was to question the very balance of the universe. Yet even as we read these inscriptions today, uncertainty remains. Were these truly literal sacrifices or metaphors later misunderstood? Did the Khmer actually bury living guardians beneath their stones, or were the tales shaped by centuries of retelling? The mystery persists, lingering in the silent corridors of Angkor's temples, where carved apsaras dance forever, and the stones themselves may hold secrets we have not yet unlocked. Among all Khmer monuments, Angkor Wat stands supreme, a sprawling temple complex built in the early 12th century under King Suryavarman II. Dedicated to Vishnu and aligned with celestial patterns, it was conceived not merely as a temple, but as a microcosm of the universe. Yet beneath its grandeur, archaeologists have found traces that raise unsettling questions about how such sacred structures were consecrated. In the 20th century, French explorers documented local legends that Angkor Wat's foundations were sanctified with offerings of life. Folklore told of children chosen to lie beneath cornerstones, their spirits transformed into guardians of the temple. For decades, these stories were dismissed as superstition, but modern excavations have complicated the picture. At certain points within Angkor and neighboring sites, skeletal remains have been unearthed, often in positions suggesting intentional placement rather than casual burial. Some appear to have been interred during construction phases, sealed beneath massive stone blocks. One particularly intriguing discovery was made near the causeway of Angkor Thom, where archaeologists identified the remains of young individuals buried close to structural supports. While definitive interpretation is difficult, the alignment of these burials with architectural elements mirrors patterns seen in other cultures where foundation sacrifices are historically attested. Similar practices are recorded in ancient India, where texts speak of Narabali, offerings of human life to stabilize great works, and in China, where chronicles describe lives buried beneath city walls. Khmer inscriptions themselves hint at the practice in metaphorical language. One stele refers to the essence that steadies the stones. Another mentions the breath of life bound into the pillars. Scholars debate whether these phrases were purely symbolic or literal descriptions veiled in poetry. The absence of written confirmation makes certainty impossible, but the convergence of folklore, archaeology, and inscription suggests that some form of life offering, real or symbolic, may indeed have occurred. If true, the implication is profound. Angkor Wat, with its towering spires and endless galleries, was not only a monument of devotion, but also a tomb of guardians, unseen yet ever present. Their vitality was believed to keep the temple eternal, holding heaven and earth together through sacrifice. Today, as tourists walk its causeways and gaze at its bas-reliefs, few imagine what might lie beneath the stones. Yet the whispers of legend remain, reminding us that the greatest temple of Southeast Asia may have been consecrated with offerings as mysterious as its design. By the 14th century, the Khmer Empire, once the most powerful force in Southeast Asia, began to falter. The monumental temples of Angkor still stood, their towers rising like lotus buds toward the sky, but the rituals that had consecrated them were fading into silence. As Theravada Buddhism spread across the region, the spiritual climate shifted. The new faith emphasized personal merit and inner devotion rather than offerings of life bound to stone. The ancient ceremonies of foundation sacrifices gradually disappeared, remembered only in whispers of legend. At the same time, the empire faced mounting challenges. Climate studies of sediment cores from Tonle Sap Lake reveal cycles of prolonged drought, followed by devastating floods in the 14th and 15th centuries. These environmental shocks strained the sophisticated hydraulic system that had sustained Angkor's population for centuries. When the reservoirs failed, crops withered and hunger spread. In the past, such crises might have inspired renewed offerings to sanctify balance, but by then the old rituals had lost their authority. Without the symbolic assurance of consecrated sacrifice, faith in the system weakened, political pressures added to the decline, regional rivals grew stronger, and invasions from Ayutthaya destabilized Angkor's control. In times past, kings would have turned to grand ceremonies to assert cosmic legitimacy, yet as rituals faded, rulers lost one of their most powerful tools of unity and authority. The stones of Angkor still proclaim divine order, but without living ceremonies to renew them, their voice grew faint. By the mid-15th century, Angkor was largely abandoned as the royal capital. Its temples, once sustained by offerings, believed to hold the cosmos together, were left to the jungle. In their absence, stories persisted among local villagers that children had been buried beneath bridges, that the spirits of guardians still watched from the stones. These legends kept alive the memory of rituals that had once defined an empire. The fall of Angkor thus raises a haunting question. Did the decline of sacrificial ritual contribute to the empire's collapse, or was it simply a reflection of deeper change? We cannot say for certain. But the parallel is striking. An empire that rose on the belief that life must be bound into stone, and that began to fade when those offerings ceased. Today, as dawn breaks over Angkor Wat and sunlight spills across its galleries, the silence of its corridors reminds us that even the mightiest civilizations can vanish, leaving only questions carved in stone. High in the Andes, where snow-capped peaks cut into the clouds and the air grows thin, the Inca Empire performed rituals that blended reverence with awe. Known as Capacocha, these ceremonies were among the most sacred acts in their religious life. They were held to honor the mountain gods, to ensure rainfall, or to mark the death of an emperor. At the heart of these rites were children, selected not as punishment, but as the purest offerings of devotion. Accounts from Spanish chroniclers such as Bernabé Cobo describe these ceremonies in solemn detail. According to his writings, the chosen children were of exceptional beauty or lineage, often the sons and daughters of nobles. They were treated with great honor in the months leading up to the ritual, fed rich diets of maize and llama meat, clothed in fine garments, and given small statues of gold and silver to accompany them. Far from being cast out, they were revered as living emissaries between humans and the gods. Archaeological discoveries have confirmed these accounts. On mountaintops across Peru, Argentina, and Chile, mummified remains of Inca children have been found, preserved by the cold for centuries. The famous Maiden of Lulailico, discovered at over 6,000 meters in Argentina, still rests in a seated position, her garments intact, her expression serene. Scientific studies revealed traces of coca leaves and maize beer in her system, suggesting she was gently prepared for her journey. To the Inca, she had not died in vain. She had ascended to live with the gods, a guardian for her people. These offerings were inseparable from the Inca worldview. Mountains were not mere landscapes, but living beings, apus, deities who controlled water and weather. To ensure harmony with these powers, the most precious gift had to be given, and what could be more precious than a child, symbol of purity and future? To modern sensibilities, such rituals are difficult to comprehend, yet within their own cultural frame, they represented devotion at its highest level. The community believed that through the offering, balance would be restored, harvests would flourish, and the empire itself would endure. Thus, in the icy silence of the Andes, we see once again the recurring theme of human history. The conviction that life must be given so that life may continue. And in the frozen faces of the Inca children, preserved for centuries, we glimpse both the solemnity of belief and the enduring mystery of sacrifice. Across the Mediterranean, on the coast of North Africa, the city of Carthage rose as a maritime power, rivaling Rome itself. Founded by Phoenician settlers from Tyre, Carthage inherited not only seafaring skill but also religious traditions rooted in the ancient Levant. Among these was devotion to Baal Hammon and Tanit, deities of fertility and protection. To them, Carthaginians are said to have offered their most treasured possessions, and, according to ancient sources, sometimes even their children. Greek and Roman writers left vivid accounts. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, described a bronze statue of Baal with outstretched arms, upon which offerings were placed before sliding into a pit of fire. To the Romans, eager to depict their rivals as cruel barbarians, such stories became powerful propaganda. They portrayed Carthage as a city sustained by flames and sorrow, a fitting enemy for Rome's destiny. For centuries, historians debated whether these tales were exaggerations. Was Carthage truly practicing large-scale child sacrifice, or were the Romans inventing horrors to justify conquest? Archaeology has shed some light. Excavations in the 20th century uncovered the Tophet of Carthage, a vast cemetery filled with urns containing the cremated remains of infants, often buried with inscriptions dedicating them to Baal or Tanit. Thousands of urns have been unearthed, spanning centuries of Carthaginian history. The evidence is complex. Some scholars argue the Tophet reflects a high rate of infant mortality, with remains cremated and dedicated after natural death. Others maintain the consistency of inscriptions and the scale of the cemetery point to ritual offerings, especially during crises such as war or famine. Whatever the truth, the Tophet stands as a haunting reminder of a society where life and faith were intertwined in ways we struggle to comprehend. To the Carthaginians themselves, these rituals, if they occurred, would not have been viewed as cruelty, but as devotion. Offering a child, the purest vessel of life, was the ultimate act of trust in the gods. In return, they sought protection for their city, victory over enemies, and harmony with the divine. When Rome finally destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, the memory of these alleged practices was used to justify the city's annihilation. Yet the question remains unsettled. Were the fires of Baal literal or symbolic flames fanned higher by Rome's rhetoric? The ashes of the Tophet whisper both possibilities, leaving us with mystery rather than certainty. Far to the northwest, beyond the mountains of Gaul and across the wind-swept isles of Britain, the Celtic tribes nurtured their own traditions of ritual and sacrifice. At the center of their spiritual life stood the Druids, priests, philosophers, and keepers of sacred lore. Though the Celts left no written records of their own, the testimony of outsiders, particularly the Romans, provides glimpses of their ceremonies. Among the most striking images is that of the Wicker Man, a towering figure woven of branches within which, according to legend, offerings were placed and consumed by fire. Julius Caesar, in his commentaries on the Gallic War, claimed that the Druids filled these giant effigies with animals and, at times, human captives who were then sacrificed to appease the gods during times of crisis. To Roman readers, this portrayal painted the Celts as fierce and alien, justifying conquest in the name of civilization. Yet modern historians approach these accounts with caution. Caesar, after all, was both general and propagandist, eager to depict his enemies as savage. archaeological evidence offers a more nuanced picture. At sites such as Lindo Moss in England, bodies preserved in peat bogs reveal individuals who died in ritualistic ways, bound, struck, and deposited in sacred wetlands. Some scholars see these as confirmation of ritual sacrifice, while others interpret them as criminal executions or symbolic offerings tied to fertility cults. The absence of clear records leaves room for debate, but the consistency of finds across northern Europe suggests ritual violence did play a role in Celtic belief. The wicker man itself may have been more metaphor than reality, a Roman exaggeration of smaller-scale rites. Yet the image endures, a vast effigy glowing against the night sky, the tribe gathered in awe, the druids chanting as fire rose to the heavens. Whether literal or symbolic, it captured the essence of Celtic spirituality, the conviction that the life force must be given back to nature in order to renew the cycle of growth and survival. For the Celts, sacrifice was not cruelty but reciprocity. Their gods were bound to the land, to rivers, forests, and skies, and to keep them benevolent required constant exchange. Offerings of food, treasure, animals, and, at times, life itself were seen as the price of harmony. To the Romans, this was barbarity. To the Celts, it was balance. The legacy of these accounts remains contested. Was the wicker man a grim reality or a myth magnified by Rome's pen? What is certain is that the idea of sacrifice as spectacle was not unique to the Mediterranean world, but echoed in the groves and marshes of distant Europe. Picture, for a moment, the year 1487. The city of Tenochtitlan rises like a vision from water, its causeways stretching across Lake Texcoco, its markets teeming with traders, its canals glinting like silver ribbons beneath the sun. At the center stands the Templo, its twin staircases leading skyward, each dedicated to a god whose favor meant survival: Huitzilopochtli, lord of the sun and war, and Tlaloc, master of rain and fertility. On this day, the entire empire has gathered. Messengers have carried invitations across hundreds of miles. Allied kings, rival leaders, merchants, farmers, and soldiers have converged upon the capital. They come not merely to celebrate, but to witness the most solemn duty of their time, the feeding of the cosmos. Without it, the Aztec believed, the sun might falter in its path, the rains might dry, and the world itself might collapse into darkness. The plaza surrounding the Templo is alive with sound. Shell trumpets echo across the lake, drums reverberate like the beating of a giant heart, and dancers in feathered costumes move in great spirals, their steps tracing cosmic patterns on the ground. Incense rises in thick clouds of copal, its resinous smoke curling upward as if to form a bridge between earth and sky. For the people gathered below, the air itself seems charged, as though the boundary between mortal and divine is trembling. At the summit of the temple, priests clad in dark robes invoke the gods. Their chants, preserved in fragments by chroniclers, speak of cycles without end, the fifth sun, destined to perish unless nourished, and the eternal struggle between light and darkness. They remind the crowd that this moment is not mere ceremony, but the fulcrum upon which existence balances. Every gesture is part of a cosmic dialogue, each act a plea to keep the sun rising tomorrow. Spanish accounts, written decades later, claim that during this dedication festival, thousands of captives were presented over several days. Modern scholars debate the numbers, but archaeological evidence, skull racks, bone deposits, and murals confirms the sheer magnitude of these ceremonies. To the Aztec, scale mattered, the greater the offering, the stronger the assurance that the universe would endure. Yet these rituals were not only religious, they were political theatre. By staging the ceremony in full view of the empire, Emperor Ahuitzotl proclaimed both piety and power. Every vassal king and visiting dignitary left with the same message etched into memory. The Aztec alone held the key to cosmic order. To defy them was to risk angering the very gods who kept the sun in the sky. For the crowd, emotions were complex. There was awe at the majesty of the spectacle, fear of the gods' demands, pride in their empire's devotion, and relief that the balance of the world had been secured. Though we may recoil at the thought today, within the Aztec worldview, the ritual was not cruelty but reassurance, the ultimate act of devotion ensuring that life could continue. This moment at Templo Mayor stands as the climax of humanity's long history of sacred offerings. From the first whispers of ritual at Göbekli Tepe to the stone tombs of Egypt, from the Andes to Angkor, the idea had grown. Life itself was the highest gift. Here, on the steps of the Aztec pyramid, it reached its fullest expression. And yet, hidden within the grandeur, was a shadow. By tying the fate of the cosmos to offerings on such a scale, the Aztec also bound their empire to a cycle of conquest. To sustain the rituals, they needed captives. To gain captives, they needed war. The very devotion that upheld the sun also propelled the empire toward conflict. In the brilliance of its faith lay the seeds of its fragility. Thus, at Templo Mayor, we see both the height and the turning point of sacrifice. It was here that humanity's belief in blood as cosmic currency shone brightest, and it was here that the weight of that belief began to press too heavily upon those who bore it. When we step back from the vivid scenes of temples and festivals, what remains is the question of consequence. What did these rituals leave behind, not only in bones and inscriptions, but in the very fabric of human culture? Across continents, the legacy of sacrifice shaped politics, religion, and memory in ways that still echo today. First, sacrifice was a tool of authority. In Mesopotamia, the king's legitimacy rested not only on victory in battle, but on his ability to appease the gods through offerings. In Egypt, the pharaoh's eternal journey was secured by companions buried at his side, binding the living to serve even in death. Among the Maya and Aztec, rulers proved their worth not merely through conquest, but through willingness to sustain cosmic balance, often by offering what was most precious. In each case, ritual reinforced hierarchy. It reminded people that leaders alone could mediate between human frailty and divine power. Second, sacrifice bound communities together. To gather in plazas, around pyramids, or before stone enclosures was to participate in a shared drama. Every witness became part of a covenant. We have given, therefore the gods will give in return. The collective act created solidarity, even in fear. In this way, sacrifice was both terrifying and unifying, a spectacle that made individuals feel part of something greater. Third, the memory of sacrifice shaped religious evolution. In Rome, the funerary combats of the Etruscans grew into gladiatorial games, eventually transformed into Christian symbolism of bread and wine. In Egypt, real attendance gave way to ushabti figurines, showing how rituals could evolve from literal to metaphorical while preserving their essence. In Buddhism's spread across Southeast Asia, the decline of human offerings marked a shift toward compassion, but the architectural grandeur of Angkor still bears silent witness to earlier practices. These transitions remind us that rituals are not static. They adapt, soften, and take new forms, yet rarely disappear altogether. The long-term influence also lingers in myth and literature. Tales of the Wicker Man, the fires of Baal, or the frozen children of the Andes still capture imaginations woven into novels, films, and debates. Whether exaggerated by conquerors or remembered through legend, these stories remind us how deeply the idea of sacrifice is etched into cultural memory. But perhaps the most haunting consequence is the question of why. Why did so many civilizations, separated by oceans and centuries, arrive at the same conclusion? That blood, more than any other gift, could secure survival. Was it simply fear of nature's chaos, or a universal recognition that life's essence carried power beyond measure? Modern science can explain weather patterns and disease, but it cannot erase the human impulse to give up something precious when faced with uncertainty. Even today, we speak of sacrificing time, wealth, or comfort for causes greater than ourselves. The language of offering has not vanished, it has transformed. These rituals also warn us of fragility. Empires that tied their destiny too tightly to sacrifice, like the Aztec, dependent on conquest for captives, created cycles that could not last. When the Spanish arrived, the very practices that had sustained Aztec cosmic order became arguments used to dismantle their world. In Angkor, the fading of rituals coincided with political and environmental collapse, raising questions about whether their decline weakened social cohesion. The long-term influence of sacrifice is thus double-edged. It shows humanity's yearning for meaning, for balance, for a way to negotiate with the unknown. But it also shows how belief, when woven into structures of power, can demand costs that grow unsustainable. As we look back across millennia, the legacy of sacrifice is not only in the ruins of temples or the pages of chronicles, it is in the enduring truth that humans will always seek to give something of themselves, sometimes symbolically, sometimes literally, in hopes of securing life, love, or legacy. The forms have changed, but the impulse remains. Across the long arc of history, we have walked through temples and tombs, across deserts and jungles, up mountains and into sacred groves. Everywhere we looked, the pattern was the same. Humanity reaching upward, offering life to secure life. From the ziggurats of Sumer to the pyramids of Egypt, from the plazas of Tenochtitlan to the frozen peaks of the Andes, people believed that only by giving their most precious essence could the world continue. Yet the story of sacrifice is not only about blood, it is about meaning. It shows us how deeply our ancestors longed to understand forces they could not control, the flood and the drought, the sickness and the storm, the rising and the setting of the sun. Their offerings, whether symbolic or real, were acts of hope, attempts to speak a language they believed the gods would hear. Over time, these rituals transformed. Attendants buried with pharaohs became Ushabti figurines. The Roman munera turned into gladiatorial games, then into the symbolic bread and wine of Christian worship. The Khmer consecrations faded into Buddhist devotion, and the fires of Baal became memories written by conquerors. Always the form changed, but the yearning remained, the desire to offer, to balance, to give something of oneself for the sake of something greater. As we close this journey, perhaps the most striking lesson is how sacrifice reflects both fragility and resilience. Fragility because empires that demanded too much could not endure, Resilience, because even as practices softened, humanity never abandoned the impulse to connect with the unknown. We still speak of sacrifice today, though in gentler terms, sacrificing time for family, energy for work, or comfort for love. The language lives on, reminding us that the essence of giving is part of who we are. So as the echoes of drums and chants fade into silence, imagine the temples now empty, their stones cooled by night. The fires have burned out, the crowds have gone home, and only the stars remain, watching as they always have. The gods, if they are listening, require nothing from you tonight. All that is asked is that you rest. Let the weight of history drift away, let the shadows of the past dissolve, and let the quiet of the present guide you gently into sleep. For in this moment the only offering you need to make is to yourself. The gift of peace, the gift of rest, the gift of dreams. Good night.